On October 16, 2018, Fox News began to cover a migrant caravan traveling through Central America. This week, they arrived at the border of Guatemala and Mexico. President Trump declared over Twitter that, quote, criminals and unknown Middle Easterners are mixed into the migrant caravan moving towards the United States, calling this, quote, a national emergency, end quote. Do we fear these migrants and their families? Is President Trump fueling a politics of fear? Since the birth of the United States, politicians and citizens have raised concerns over and over about immigration. The influx of Eastern Europeans, Italians, Irish in the early 1800s, a blocking of Asians and African immigration in the first half of the 20th century. In the 21st century, what are our responsibilities towards immigrants and refugees? Should we close or open our borders? Professor Joseph Carens has addressed these important questions and many more. You cannot work on issues of immigration without being aware and referencing Professor Carens' work. He's written 4 books, co-edited 2 others, and published over 90 articles and book chapters. His most recent book, The Ethics of Immigration, won 5 book awards. In the Times Literary Supplement Review, Sarah Fine writes, quote, Joseph Carens is hoping to carry the more skeptical section of our history readership with him for longer, illustrating just how far democratic commitments already take us while still granting states a wide degree of discretion over immigrant admissions. The result is a brilliant, engaging, persuasive book which attempts to reconcile the claims of democratic communities and the claims of migrants. No doubt it'll be at the top of the reading list for the new president of the European Commission, end quote. His awards for scholarship do not stop here. His book, Culture, Citizenship, and Community, also won the Macpherson Award. And his 1987 article, Aliens and Citizens, The Case for Open Borders, has been reprinted 15 times, including translations into French, German, Spanish. YSU students read this article in political philosophy and the nature of the state. Doctors Alan Tomhave and Gabriel Paul Fernandez reference his work in their courses. And currently, he is a chapter in Dr. Bruce Waller's new ethics book. And Dr. Carens is working on a project entitled Taming the Market, whose goal is to find out ways to separate the organizational virtues of the market from its distributional and other defects. Professor Carens is a professor of political philosophy and a fellow of the Royal Society of Canada at the University of Toronto. Before moving to the University of Toronto, he taught at North Carolina State University, Lake Forest College, Wesleyan University, and Princeton University. His service has been invaluable, not just within academics, but the wider intellectual community. His New York Times article entitled, When Immigrants Lose Their Human Rights, has electrified conversations on the internet, as is one of the most popular articles on the American Political Science Association's website. Within the American Political Science Association, in addition to presenting papers at over 20 of their meetings, he served as an instrumental chair in their organization. Speaking today on immigration and morality, Professor Carens will talk on the moral questions raised by immigration. It is thus a great honor to have such an important scholar at YSU today. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Joseph Carens.
Thanks for that generous introduction, Michael. So it's a great pleasure to be here in Ohio, which is actually the state where I was born. I didn't last here long, only about 3 months. My parents moved back to Massachusetts, where I grew up. And I mention this in part because some of you are probably wondering, well, why is this guy from Canada coming down to tell us Americans about immigration? So I am a Canadian. I've been there for over 30 years, and so I've become a Canadian citizen, but I'm also an American. And I lived in America a long time before I moved to Canada. So I'm one of those dual citizens that people sometimes warn you about, and by the end of this talk, you'll probably understand why. Okay. So immigration is a hot political topic, and I know that, but what I'd like to do in the talk today is to get you to pull back a little from the political context, set aside partisan political concerns, and even set aside for a few moments your own immediate interests and inclinations, and reflect upon the ways in which immigration raises questions about our most fundamental moral values, about what we think is right and wrong, just and unjust. You may not agree with my views. Most people don't, actually. And certainly no conventional politician, Democrat or Republican, would embrace them. Let me be clear about that. They'd be kicked out of office if they did. But I hope you'll experience what I have to say as challenging in a good sense, something that may provoke you, but may also assist you to think about immigration at a deeper level than the one that's normally used in political debates. I mean, that's what universities are for, after all, to help us think and reflect more deeply. And I hope this talk will do that, whatever your own final views on this issue. And really, I hope, we'll have conversations afterwards, but I hope it'll lead you to discuss these topics with your friends and neighbors in the kind of open, candid way that can happen when democracies work well. People talk with one another and respect one another even when they disagree. So I hope this will kind of stimulate that kind of conversation. And let me just start by noting that there are a lot of issues related to immigration about which there's not very much controversy. So the question of access to citizenship for the children of legal immigrants, for example, who are settled, they get citizenship automatically. That's not a very controversial thing. The kinds of rights that legal immigrants have, that's not very controversial. Kind of including legal immigrants. There's a whole set of things like that that don't stir up much debate, and that's good. But in a way, these things, I'm going to focus on the things that do stir up a lot of debate. So I'm happy to talk about those other things if you want afterwards, but I'm going to focus on three controversial topics. The first is, what should we do about irregular migrants? The second is, what are our responsibilities towards refugees? And the third is, are we really entitled to control immigration at all? Or should borders be generally open? So in my talk, I'm just going to assume I'm talking to people who accept democratic principles, using that term very broadly to contrast it, say, with extreme forms of authoritarianism. And I should add, so I teach political philosophy and I teach Plato and Nietzsche, so I think it's fine to talk with people who don't like democracy, to think about the challenges that they pose at another level. And that's an important thing to do intellectually, but I'm not going to do that here. I'm going to presuppose that I'm talking to people who have a broad commitment to democratic values, even though people can interpret those in different ways and understand them in different ways. And in the first two parts of my talk, I'm going to make another further limiting assumption, which is that I'm going to assume that states have the right generally to control immigration, and see the ways in which that might be qualified, even if you take that as a presupposition. And that's what most people think. I call this the conventional view, that states are entitled to control immigration. I call it the conventional view because it's what most people think. But then in the last part of my talk, I'm going to challenge the conventional view and see if I can probe that a little further. Okay, so I'm going to start with the issue of irregular migrants, which is the term I use if people who support, I use this term for people who've settled in a country without authorization. Maybe they crossed the border without authorization. Maybe they came with a visa and then overstayed it and so on. Anyway, they are not legal residents. They don't have official status. And some people who don't like them call them illegal immigrants. People who tend to support them call them the undocumented. I use this term irregular migrants because I want to have an argument and not just presuppose the answer in the way I define the term. But that term has its own problem. Anyway, that's what I'm going to call it. You know who I'm talking about. Okay, so here's the question. What legal rights, if any, should irregular migrants have? How should we treat them? Now, so remember, I'm starting with the assumption that the state gets to control immigration. So it follows then that if states apprehend irregular migrants, they're morally entitled to deport them. Nevertheless, I want to claim that irregular migrants should enjoy at least some important legal rights, and further that states should create a firewall between the enforcement of immigration laws on the one hand, which they're entitled to do, and the protection of these legal rights of irregular migrants on the other hand, so that the rights can be really effective. And furthermore, I'm going to say that over time, even though states have a right to deport irregular migrants, if they catch them when they first arrive, soon after they've arrived, over time, that right gets eroded, and irregular migrants should acquire legal status. So two arguments about irregular migrants. Now, some people might say, well, why should irregular migrants have any legal rights at all? They're violating the state's laws by settling and working without authorization. Why should the state be obliged to give them any legal rights at all? But if you reflect for a moment about that, you'll see that irregular migrants are certainly entitled to some legal rights. I mean, we don't live in the Middle Ages anymore. In the Middle Ages, people who committed crimes, sometimes even minor crimes, like stealing a loaf of bread, they were made outlaws, literally. That's where the term comes from. They were outside the protection of the law, and anybody could do anything to them, kill them, assault them. So it's kind of like the Old West, wanted dead or alive, At least in the Old West, unlike the Middle Ages, they tended to reserve that status for people who had done something pretty serious, murder, some kind of bank robbery, something very serious. So we don't have that anymore. And so you don't get to shoot somebody because you discover she doesn't have a visa, right? I think even people who are hostile to immigrants generally recognize that's a limit. So immigrants are clearly entitled to the protection of their basic human rights, which include things like the security of person. You can't be assaulted, and your property. You're not supposed to be robbed. And the police are supposed to protect people from being robbed and killed, even if they're irregular migrants, right? Or if you get accused of a crime, you're an irregular migrant, you get the same legal rights as any other defendant. Or say you get in an accident, you're hit by a car. You taken to the hospital, they shouldn't say, well, we're not going to fix that broken leg because you're an irregular migrant. You're supposed to respond to emergency health care, right? So they do have legal rights. But the problem is this. The migrants can't exercise their legal rights effectively, even when their most basic human rights, like, not being assaulted or robbed. Even when their most basic human rights are at stake, they can't exercise them effectively. They're afraid to do so. Why? Well, because if they appeal to the police, they might get turned in to the immigration authorities. So they put up with the violation of basic rights in order not to be deported. Now, this is a serious problem. It makes no moral sense to provide people with purely formal legal rights under conditions that make it impossible for them to exercise those rights effectively. So you might say, well, what's to be done? What can we do about it? Well, there is a solution, at least a partial solution. And that is, states can and they should build a firewall between immigration law enforcement on the one hand. I'm not saying you can't enforce the immigration laws. Firewall between that task and the protection of basic human rights on the other. We ought to establish as a firm legal principle that no information that is gathered by people responsible for protecting and realizing basic human rights can be used for immigration enforcement purposes. We ought to guarantee that people will be able to pursue their basic rights without exposing themselves to apprehension and deportation. So, if irregular migrants are victims of a crime or witnesses to one, they should be able to go to the police, report the crime, serve as witnesses without fear that this will increase their chances of being apprehended and deported by immigration officials. If they need emergency health care, they should be able to seek help without worrying that the hospital will disclose their identity to the people responsible for enforcing immigration laws. Now, some people say, well, look, that's impossible. You can't expect or require state officials not to cooperate with one another in matters of law enforcement. But in fact, we do this all the time outside the area of immigration. For example, in the United States, you're legally required to report your income, even if that income was obtained illegally. I don't know how many of you know the story of Al Capone. This is how they convicted Al Capone, the great bootlegger. Not for bootlegging, but for not reporting his income on his income tax form. So you might say, well, how can you make him report his income tax when it's illegal? Well, because you've got the Fifth Amendment, the right against self-incrimination. And the answer to that is the income tax people are not allowed to tell the police about the sources of the income and those kinds of details. They've built a firewall. So that's how they can collect the income tax, even if your source of income is illegal. So that's just one example of many. There are many areas in which we say this information is private. And the fact that some officials have it doesn't mean that other officials can get access to it. So that's all I'm saying with respect to irregular migrants. We want to have this firewall between what the people who are enforcing immigration laws, which for this purpose I'm assuming they're entitled to do, and the people who have to protect basic rights. Okay. Now the second claim I want to make, it's actually a little more controversial, is that as time passes, irregular migrants acquire a moral right to stay and have their status regularized. So the basic point is this. Look, the longer you stay in a society, the stronger your claim to be a member of that society, even if you've settled without authorization. When you settle in a country, you form connections and attachments that generate strong moral claims over time. You become a member of the community. And so after a while, the conditions of admission become irrelevant. So look, I know a lot of people will be skeptical about this, so I'm going to tell you the story of Margaret Grimmond. Now, this is a true story. So Margaret Grimmond was born in the United States, and at the age of 4, her mother took her to live in Scotland. And that's where she lived her entire life. She married, she had kids, family. And at the age of 80, Margaret Grimmond went on a family vacation to Australia. And when she did this, she got an American passport. So she knew she was an American citizen and not a British citizen. So off she goes to Australia, has a nice family vacation apparently, comes back to the UK, and the immigration official says, "Hey, where's your right to live in the UK? You're an illegal immigrant. You have to go home to America." So Margaret Grimmond, 80-year-old Granny Grimmond, is scared by this. It kind of sounds like a funny story, but actually imagine your 80-year-old grandmother who's suddenly faced being sent to a country where she knows nobody has never lived. So let me cut to the chase. Granny Grimmond's okay. She did not get deported, precisely because when this story became public, everyone could see the absurdity of taking this 80-year-old woman and sending her back to some place where she had never lived. Right? She'd been there since 4. So what are they recognizing? That there's some wild disproportion between the technical legal status and what's the right thing to do. So first of all, notice part of the problem there was she was carried off at the age of 4. So I assume a lot of you are going to make that connection with the Dreamers in the United States, right? If you come as a kid, you do what your parents tell you. Your parents, you're not responsible for that. So, and now you've lived in the society, you've become a member of that society, you've become an American. So you should have status as an American. You should be allowed to live there, recognized, given legal status. That's the easiest case, and a lot of people recognize that one. But even if you've come at a later age, so what if Granny Grimmond had come at age 20 instead of age 4? Would we think at age 80 she should be deported because she did that at age 20? We recognize in lots of spheres of life that the passage of time matters. So in the criminal law, for example, we have a statute of limitations. So if you've committed some crime, say you stole something, you broke some minor law, after a certain amount of time, usually it's about 5 years, you can't be prosecuted for that. Now, they don't do that for serious crimes, murder, extreme forms of assault. They say, no, the statute of limitations doesn't run out on those. But if it's a minor crime, the idea is you shouldn't be expected, even if you did something wrong, you can't be expected to live forever with that sort of Damocles dangling over your head, the danger of that. It's just not reasonable from a human point of view. And their property law is the same thing. If you occupy property, it wasn't yours in the first place, but you occupy it uncontested for several years, it becomes yours. It's another part of it. So we have all kinds of ways in which we recognize that the passage of time matters. So even when people have come, you can say, if you caught them early, you get to kick them out. They've been living there. Often they've been paying taxes. They've been working hard. They haven't violated any criminal laws. They should get legal status. So that's the argument about regularization. Okay. Let me turn now to the question of refugees. So notice, even if we accept the conventional view about the state's right to exercise discretionary control over immigration, everyone, well, these days you shouldn't say everyone, almost everyone recognizes that refugees have a special claim. Refugees are a special case. And we've come to this view because of the way we responded, or really the way we failed to respond, to people fleeing the Nazis in the 1930s. So, Jewish refugees, we kept most of them out. I don't know how many of you will know that history, but that's the fact of the matter. People who were fleeing the Nazis. There's a famous case, a boatload of Jewish refugees arrived from Europe to, first they tried to go to Cuba, then they tried to go to the United States, then they tried to go to Canada, and they were turned away at each point. Sent back to Europe, and many of them died in the Holocaust. And we prevented Jews from coming by requiring, say, you have to get a visa. And then if it turns out you're Jewish, we won't give you a visa. so we put obstacles in their paths. And if you say, well, why wouldn't we admit Jewish refugees in those days? If you listen to the arguments, they're a lot like the arguments you hear today, right? Well, we've got our own problems. It's too expensive. We've got unemployment. Hey, these are not the most needy anyway, because if they could afford to get on a boat and come over here, they're probably relatively rich. Maybe some of them are only pretending to be Jewish. Maybe they're really Nazis in disguise. Maybe they're communists. I'm not making this up. These were the arguments that were actually made. You can look it up. One prominent government official explicitly worried that there were Nazi saboteurs hiding, pretending to be refugees. Well, after World War II, people in the United States and other, it was the same in Canada, it was the same in other European states, they recognized that this exclusion of Jewish refugees had been a terrible moral failure on our part. It condemned people to death. So we created an international refugee regime that guarantees that if somebody lands on your shore, they can't be returned to a place where they'll be subject to persecution. The idea was, let's not make the same, never again make that mistake. Let's protect refugees. But now we are once again failing to provide refugees with the protection that they need. And how is that? Well, what all the rich states have done, so the United States has done it, but so has Canada, so have the states in Europe, is they've instituted these rules that say, if you want to come to our country from a poor country that might generate refugees, you have to get a visa. And if you go in, march into the consulate and they say, why are you coming, to the United States? It's because I want to make a refugee claim. Visa denied. So it's a kind of catch-22. Now, this is an obvious point, but it's worth making explicit. You can't claim to have addressed the refugee problem if you set up a regime to protect refugees that you prevent the refugees from using. Right? That's not a solution. And that's precisely what we've done, at least with respect to many refugees. Some make it here and they claim asylum, and some do get in, but we've made it very, very hard to get in by arriving in the country and claiming asylum. So it's the inaccessibility. But in addition to that, the current refugee regime, the way we deal with refugees collectively, is deeply inadequate in other ways, mainly because of the way it assigns responsibility for taking care of refugees. So think about that. What do refugees need? Ask yourself this question. What do refugees need, and who should provide it? So the first thing they need is a safe haven. So we're not getting into the question here about whether they're really refugees or not. I'm assuming we're talking about people who are really refugees. It's recognized. And there are millions and millions, many, tens of millions of people who fit in that category. There's no doubt about whether they're really refugees or not. Right? So what do they need? Well, first they need a safe haven. Someplace where their lives won't be in danger and their basic human rights will be respected. And for these purposes, refugee camps make a certain amount of sense, that people are just trying to get out of there, and they cross the border, they get in some camp, they get food, clothing, and shelter. That's okay, as long as it's properly organized and supported, which is often not, by the way. But here's the point. It's not reasonable to expect people to live their entire lives in a refugee camp. That's okay for a few months, maybe a year. But you can't expect people to live their entire lives in a refugee camp. But that's what we do today. Millions of refugees, not just a few, millions and millions of refugees spend long years, sometimes their entire lifetimes, in camps with little or no education for the children, limited or no economic opportunity for the adults, and extreme physical danger, especially for the women. This is not an acceptable way to treat people in desperate need. So refugees who can't return home within a reasonable period, so if they can go home, okay, the principle is you should go to the state where you're a citizen, and sometimes things change. You can go home, okay, fine. But if you can't go home within a reasonable period, then there's a duty to find these people a new home, someplace where they can live a normal life. Okay, well, who should provide that? Who should provide refugees with what they need? Well, if you're talking about the safe haven, the initial moment, then you can say, well, the neighboring states make sense because people have crossed the borders. That's just how it is. So that makes it especially if the states don't have to bear the financial burden, if they're supported by others from outside, it's reasonable to have the immediate safety be provided by neighboring states. But there's no reason to expect the neighboring states to provide refugees with a new home, if that's what they need, right? That's a responsibility that ought to be shared by all of the states. The neighboring states aren't responsible, in most cases, for the fact that these people have become refugees. They didn't do anything. So but what we do today is we just let the burden fall on the neighboring states. Turkey has taken in millions of refugees. Lebanon is a country of only a few million people, and it has 1 million refugees in its population. Jordan has taken in millions, and there are many others. Now remember, these states are not responsible for the fact that the people became refugees in the first place. So it's just not reasonable to expect them to be the only ones to provide the refugees with the new homes that they need. We have a responsibility, we in Canada, we in the United States, we in Europe, a responsibility to take them in as well. And we have failed terribly to meet this responsibility. And some people say, well, taking in large numbers of refugees is just too much to ask of us. But many states, including the United States and Canada, did much better after the war in Vietnam, where we did recognize, okay, they're refugees because whether you were supporting the war or opposing the war, most Americans recognized the reason these people are refugees is because of the war in Vietnam, for which we're responsible. So we should take in the refugees. And there was a generous, positive response to refugees from Southeast Asia. But, you couldn't say the same about the response to refugees from Iraq, say, right? So why not? That we were involved in that war. Sometimes there are the famous cases of people who served as translators. The reason they're in danger is because of their connection to Americans. So there'd be a special responsibility in those cases. But these other experiences show that we do have the capacity. It's not that there's not a demand and a strain, but we have the capacity to take in large numbers. Germany took in 1 million refugees quite recently. So look, there are different ways to think about how the responsibility for resettling refugees should be shared. Obviously, the size of the population of a state is one consideration. You can't expect Norway with 5 million people or something to take in as many as the United States with 300 million. And there are economic capacities. There are different ways of calculating it and arguing about what's important and what's not. But whatever, you tell me whatever you think would be a fair way of sharing that responsibility. Some plausible account of what would be a fair way. And I guarantee you that most rich states today are not doing their fair share according to that standard, whatever the standard is, not remotely. And so here's the point. The question that we ought to be asking ourselves, and almost never do, is what do we imagine will happen to these people if we don't let them in? Why do we think it's acceptable to foist off the responsibility for them on the neighboring states and to shut our eyes to the limited lives that so many people will face if we refuse to take them in? Okay, I'm going to turn now to the controversial part of my talk. This is the case for open borders. So far I've been assuming that states get the right to control, but now I'm going to challenge that. Borders have guards, and the guards have guns. Well, that's an obvious fact of political life, but in a way it's one that's easily hidden from view, at least from the view of those of us who are citizens of affluent democracies, right? If we see the guards at all when you're walking through, the airport and so on, if you see the guards, you find them reassuring. We think of them as there to protect us, rather than to keep us out. Sometimes a little hassle, but basically, you're glad they're there. They're there to protect you. To Africans in small leaky vessels seeking to avoid patrol boats while they cross the water to southern Europe, to Mexicans willing to risk death from heat and exposure in the Arizona desert to evade fences and border controls, it's quite different. To these people, the borders, the guards, the guns, are all too apparent, and their goal of exclusion all too real. So what justifies the use of force against such people? Look, maybe borders and guards can be justified as a way of keeping out terrorists, armed invaders, criminals. Fair enough. But most of those trying to get in are not like that, as the caravan that Michael was talking about. We know the people in this caravan, the vast majority of them, the vast, vast, vast majority, maybe all of them, they're just ordinary, peaceful people seeking the opportunity to build decent, secure lives for themselves and their families. So, now maybe they wouldn't qualify as refugees. Maybe they would. Have to hear the case to see. But even if they didn't qualify as refugees, they're not armed invaders. They're just, again, trying to find an opportunity for decent life. So on what moral grounds can we deny entry to these sorts of people? What gives anyone the right to point guns at them, at these kind of people? Now, to many people, the answer to this question will seem obvious. What they'll say is, look, it's too bad, but the power to admit or exclude non-citizens is inherent in sovereignty. And it's essential for any political community that seeks to exercise self-determination. Every state has the legal and moral right to exercise control over admissions in pursuit of its own national interest and of the common good of the members of its community, even if that means denying entry to peaceful, needy foreigners. States can choose to be generous in admitting immigrants, but in most cases, at least, they're under no moral obligation to do so. You get to decide what's good for us. So that's the view I want to challenge. That's the conventional view. It's widely shared, deeply held, and I think it's wrong. So I'm going to argue that borders should generally be open, and people should normally be free to leave their country of origin and settle wherever they choose. I think this critique of exclusion has particular force with respect to restrictions on movement from people in the global south to rich states in Europe and North America, but it applies more generally. So here's the heart of it. Think about it this way. Citizenship in Western democracies is the modern equivalent of feudal class privilege. It's an inherited status that greatly enhances your life chances. To be born a citizen of a rich state in Europe or North America is kind of like being born into the nobility in the Middle Ages. I know many of us belong to the lesser nobility, but still. To be born a citizen of a poor country in Asia or Africa is like being born into the peasantry, even if there are some rich peasants, and some peasants manage to gain entry to the nobility. Like feudal birthright privileges, contemporary social arrangements grant great advantages on the basis of birth and then entrench those advantages by legally restricting mobility, making it extremely difficult for people born into a socially disadvantaged position to overcome that disadvantage, no matter how hard they work, no matter how talented they are. And like feudal practices, these contemporary social arrangements are hard to justify if you think about them closely. See, in the Middle Ages, reformers objected to the way that feudalism restricted freedom, including the freedom of people to move from one place to another in search of a better life. Now, that constraint was crucial to the maintenance of the feudal system. You had to keep the nobles had to keep the serfs, the peasants on the land. You couldn't just move from one place to another because you didn't like the way you were treated. But modern practices of state control over borders tie people to the land of their birth almost as effectively. Limiting entry to rich democratic states is a crucial mechanism for protecting a birthright privilege. And if the feudal practices protecting birthright privileges were wrong, what justifies the modern ones? There are millions of people in poor states today who long for the freedom and economic opportunity they could find in Europe and in North America. Many of them take great risks to come. Again, we're seeing that with this caravan. If the borders were open, millions more would move. The exclusion of so many poor and desperate people seems hard to justify from a perspective that takes seriously the claims of all human beings to be regarded as free and equal moral persons. That's a fundamental. So when I say I'm assuming people are committed to democratic values, the fundamental democratic value that I'm appealing to there is the assumption of the moral equality of all human beings. We don't think that there are some human beings who start by being morally inferior to other human beings. They're a different class. They're a different race. They're inferior. No, we say everybody, every human being is a moral equal. So, when you say that, how do you justify the way we have organized the modern world and these restrictions on freedom of movement? Now look, some people are going to say, open borders would be contrary to our interests. Well, maybe they're right. But if we want to act ethically, we have to give reasons for our institutions and our practices. And those reasons have to take a certain form. It's never enough to justify a set of political and social arrangements governing human beings to say, well, these arrangements are good for us, without regard for others, no matter who the us is. We have to use principles and arguments that take everyone's interest into account, or that explain why the social arrangements are reasonable and fair to everyone who is subject to them. What's the story? What is the story you're going to tell the vast majority of people in the rest of the world as to why this way of organizing the world is okay? What would be persuasive? What would you believe if you were on the other side of the fence? See, the New Yorker, I don't know how many of you read the New Yorker, it's great for cartoons, right? So it has a cartoon that's worth mentioning here. It shows two kings talking to one another. And the first one says to the second, well, monarchy may not be the best form of government in principle, but it has always seemed the best form of government for me. And I'm afraid that those of us who live in rich states today, we're a lot like that king. The way the world is organized may be hard to justify in principle, but it's good for us. Though, look, I have no illusions about the likelihood of rich states actually opening their borders. You know, I don't think, oh, people are going to listen to this talk, we're going to go open the borders. That is not what I think, right? My motivation for this talk is my sense that it's of vital importance to gain a critical perspective on the ways in which our collective choices are constrained, even when we can't do anything much to alter those constraints. Social institutions and practices can be deeply unjust, and yet so firmly established that for practical purposes, you have to take them as background givens in deciding how to act in the world at a given moment in time. So you can have an argument about what to do about the caravan. You can't have an argument for policy purposes about open borders. That's not on the policy agenda. But still, it doesn't mean we shouldn't think about it and talk about it and criticize it and reflect and have in mind where we're trying to head. Look, feudalism and slavery were unjust social arrangements. Yet there were times in the past when they were so deeply entrenched that there was no hope of transcending them in the foreseeable future. You had to kind of operate within their constraints. Even so, criticism was still appropriate. So if we have to take fundamentally unjust arrangements as given for purposes of immediate action in a particular context, okay, but we should not forget about the assessment of their fundamental character. Otherwise, we end up legitimating what should only be endured. Of course, most people think that the democratic states they live in, the United States, Canada, Europe, the institutions we inhabit have nothing in common with feudalism and slavery from a normative perspective. They say, well, the social arrangements of democratic states are just, or, well, nearly so. And it's precisely that complacency that the open borders argument is intended to undermine. For I imagine, or at least I hope, that in a century or two, people will look back upon our world with bafflement and shock. And just as we wonder about the moral blindness of feudal aristocrats and southern slave owners, future generations may ask themselves, well, how could Democrats today possibly have failed to see the deep injustice of a world so starkly divided between the haves and the have-nots? Why did we feel so complacent about this division, so unwilling to do what we could to change it? So the argument for open borders is one way of bringing this deep injustice of the modern world into view. You know, it's not a solution, really, to the problem, because the ideal solution would be to create a just world in which people could have good, meaningful lives at home, and they wouldn't feel so pressured to leave their homes. That's what we ought to be aiming at, transforming the overall conditions. But if you start to make that argument, then people say, well, yeah, but we don't know how to do that. We don't know about how to make development. We don't know how to intervene so we don't know what to do. So, okay, and sometimes, and honestly, sometimes that's true, but here's what we do know how to do. We know how to let people in. So if you really are committed to that vision and recognize the injustice of the modern world, it's not all or nothing. You can do something about it. You can let more people in. So the open borders makes our responsibility for keeping people from immigrating. It brings it out. Our responsibility for that is clear and direct. Whatever our responsibility for the bad things that happen elsewhere, our responsibility for keeping people from immigrating is clear and direct. We have to use overt force to keep people from moving. We need borders with barriers. and guards with guns to keep out people whose only goal is to work hard to build a decent life for themselves and their children. And that is something we could change. At the least, we could let more people in. Our refusal to do so is a choice that we make, and the one that keeps many of them from having a chance at a decent life. Thank you.